Good day, everyone, and again, welcome to Introduction to the Philosophy of the Human Person. For today's lesson, we will be dealing with the nature of philosophy. But before we proceed to that particular topic, let us have the essential questions that hopefully we will be answered at the end of our discussion. What is philosophy? Then, how does philosophy emerge? Lastly, why is philosophy considered as the mother discipline? Any investigation regarding the nature of things in general is considered as physis or nature in English term. So what does it mean? From the very beginning, different elements of the earth really exist, like water, fire, even rain, and so on and so forth. And from that, people tried to answer those questions about existence. Like for example, bakit nga ba umuulan? Bakit kumikidlat? Saan nanggagaling ang pag-ihip ng hangin? Bakit nabubuhay ang tao? And so on and so forth. So those kind of investigation, yung pagsisiyasat, pananaliksik, at pagtuklas sa mga katanungan ng mga tao tungkol sa pinagmumulan ng bagay-bagay, ito ay tinatawag na physis or nature. But the existence of philosophy does not end with this physis or nature. Later on, in the person of Warner, one of the ancient thinkers, he believed in the mythological tradition. So in other words, nakita nitong si Warner kung papaanong ang mga tao ay labis na nagpapahalaga sa mga Diyos-Diyosan. Kung babalikan natin yung mga pinag-aralan ninyo sa inyong literature, anong sinasabi? That there are gods and goddesses who protect the world or who protect the people from any danger. And that is why, during that time, ang mga tao ay nag-aalay ng kung ano-ano sa mga Diyos-Diyosa na ito because they want to preserve the beauty and the order of the earth. Kaya nga anong sabi nila? Kapag kumukulog, pwedeng nagagalit ang Diyos. Kapag kumikidlat, pwedeng ipinapahayag ng mga Diyos-Diyosa na ito yung kanilang kapangyarihan. And from that kind of experience that people encountered, sumibol yung tinatawag nating mythological tradition. So everything that exists during that ancient times are always associated with these gods and goddesses that people are trying to worship and offered something in order for them to gain the attention and love of these gods and goddesses. But later on, that mythological tradition was being aside. Why? That was because of Thales. Thales was known as the father of philosophy because during 650 before Common Era, Thales was considered as one of the great thinker of their times. Bakit? Because he started to diverge from the mythological tradition and sought to answer questions like, what is that underlying substance that reality is made of? How do things come to be changed and pass away? Or is there something that remains amidst all these changes? So in other words, during that 650 before Common Era, itong si Thales na ito ay nagsimulang baguhin ang pananaw ng sambayanan. Bakit? Because according to him, everything that exists has that underlying substance. May pinagmumulan at may pinanggagalingan. So hindi siya nanatili sa pananaw na kapag kumukulog, kumikidlat ay maaaring nagagalit ng Diyos. Na kapag umuulan ay maaaring lumuluha ang Diyos ng kalangitan. So he diverged, meaning to say binago niya ang pagkakaroon ng pananaw na tulad or hango dun sa tinatawag nating mythological tradition. Kaya nga, from that kind of philosophy or perspective in life, he tried to answer different questions like, what is that underlying substance that reality is made of? So for instance, paano mo masasabing ang isang puno ay puno? What are those underlying substances that made a tree considered as a tree? O for example, ang isang tao. How do we consider a human person as a human person? So ito yung mga naging katanungan sa isip ni Thales. Papaano nagbabago ang mga bagay-bagay? So for example, upon looking at the tree, anong sinasabi ni Thales? Paanong yung isang bunga ng mangga na pinitas mo mula sa kanyang puno, ito'y kulay green, pero sa paglipas ng panahon, paano ito nagiging dilaw? How this thing come to be? Change and later on, pass away. Nawawala, naglalaho. Again, like the human person. Paano nag-exist ang tao? Paano siya nagbabago sa paglipas ng panahon? At paano siya nawawala or lumilipas sa mundong ibabaw? So this kind of questions are the questions that Thales are trying to answer. And besides, or aside from this kind of inquiries that Thales had in his mind, he also considered water as the ultimate or the underlying substance that reality is made of. Bakit? Para sa kanya, ang pinaka-tugatog ng katotohanan ng pag-iral ng daigdig sa mundo ay water. Kaya nga, according to Thales, everything is water. Why? Because according to him, upon looking at the earth, upon looking at the world, you may see that the bigger part of the world or the earth is composed of water. And even if we will try to look at the body of the human person, 70% is considered as water. And from there, he conclude that everything is water. And that water is the underlying principle of the existence or of the reality. So, what was the significance of that philosophy or perspective in life that Thales contribute into the emergence of philosophy? Bakit napakalaki ng naging ambag ni Thales sa larangan ng filosofiya or sa larangan ng pag-iral, pagsibol ng tinatawag nating filosofiya? Thales' contributions is considered as one of the greatest contributions in this emergence of philosophy because from that perspective of Thales, we had that Western philosophy. So meaning to say, sumibol ang kaisipan na ang lahat ng bagay ay maaaring ipaliwanag sa pamamagitan ng sariling kakayanan, kapasidad, at pag-iisip ng tao. From there, they assumed that it is within man's rational ability to abstract and explain reality. And aside from that, it was also assumed that there must be an order in the universe, and that the universe must be an orderly system known as cosmos, governed by laws or logos, which could be explained by man through the process of abstraction. Ganito kalaki ang ambag ni Thales sa larangan ng kalikasan or pag-iral, pagsibol ng filosofiya, sapagkat sa pamamagitan ng kanyang mga perspektibo, pagpapaliwanag, nabuhay ang kaisipan ng mga tao na, teka, meron palang pinanggagalingan ang mga nangyayari sa mundo. Meron palang bumubuo sa lahat ng umiiral sa mundo. So katulad ng sinabi ni Thales, that the earth itself, the universe itself, must be an orderly system known as cosmos. And that this world or this earth is always governed by laws or logos. So, that is the nature of philosophy or the origin of philosophy. So before we proceed to next slide, let us have first a review again. When we will be talking about the nature of philosophy, paano nga ba siya nagmula? The origin of philosophy, sabi natin, nung unang panahon, during that ancient times, lahat ng uri ng pagsisiyasat, pagtuklas, ay tinatawag na physis or nature in English term. At sa paglipas ng panahon, sumibol yung tinatawag nating mythological tradition wherein nagkaroon ng mga paliwanag or explanations associated into gods and goddesses. So lahat daw ng nangyayari sa daigdig na nararanasan ng tao sa iba't ibang pamamaraan, sa iba't ibang panig at sulok ng mundo, these are all associated with gods and goddesses. But later on, during 650 BC or before a common era, we had Thales, who was known as the father of the philosophy, who changes the minds, the perspectives, and the beliefs of the people. Why? Because from there, people come to think and come into the reality that they can rationalize and they have that ability to abstract and explain the reality. And that was the emergence of what we called Western philosophy. All right? So, to continue with our discussion, it is also important for us to know the meaning of philosophy by looking at the Greek words for philosophy. So, philosophy comes from the two Greek words philo, which means to love, and Sophia, which means wisdom. So, in other words, when we will be talking about philosophy, it means love for wisdom or love of wisdom. To better understand what do we mean by philosophy, in other words, we can summarize it. Philosophy concerns itself with the most fundamental human questions about reality, existence, knowledge, values, reason, mind, and language. This summary or this definition of philosophy is actually what we will be dealing later on. This describes the branches of philosophy. But before we proceed with that, let us first okay? So these are the basic questions of human person that we may ask in our life. And sabi nga natin, the moment we ask question, the moment we wonder about so many things, that is actually the beginning of philosophy. So we begin to philosophize. Sabi nga lang natin, noon, di pa siya napapangalanan, di pa siya natatawag, or di pa siya identified as philosophy. But believe it or not, or admit it or not, philosophy, ang filosofiya ay nagsimula noon. Okay? Aside from the meaning that we had a while ago, philosophy is also defined as the science that by natural light of reason studies the first causes or highest principles of all things. So like what I have said, it deals with the ultimate substance or ultimate principle of the reality. That is why it focuses on the first causes or highest principles of all things. Aside from that, philosophy could be known or could be considered also as science. Why? Because in science, the investigation is systematic and it follows certain steps or it employs certain procedures. It is an organized body of knowledge just like any other sciences. So katulad ng science na gumagamit ng scientific method, philosophy also deals with several steps or certain steps to employ certain procedures. So in other words, in philosophy, you cannot directly or immediately made your conclusion without taking or going through the several steps or certain steps to prove what you believe. Aside from that, philosophy could be considered as natural light of reason. Why? Because in philosophy, the philosopher uses his natural capacity to think or simply human reason alone or the so-called unaided reason. So, unaided because, sabi natin, ito ay sariling pananaw, sariling pagpapahayag, sariling pagpapaliwanag ng tao. Like Thales, who explained that the earth is composed of water, so he explained it based on his own capacity or ability to rationalize and explain everything how this thing happened. Then, philosophy is also considered as the study of all things. Why? Because it is not one-dimensional or partial. It is multidimensional or holistic because in philosophy, philosophers studies human beings, society, religion, language, God, and plants, among other concerns. Philosophy is also considered as the first cause or highest principle, like what I have said before, that a principle is that from which something proceeds in any manner whatsoever. So what does it mean? That in philosophy, philosophers always believe that there is underlying principle behind the existence of everything. Alright, let us now proceed to the branches of philosophy that I am referring to a while ago. The first one is metaphysics. Metaphysics is the branch of philosophy which is responsible for the preserve our lives. The second is ethics. It is the branch of philosophy that explores the nature of moral virtue and evaluates human actions. So, in other words, ethics has something to do with the nature of the moral judgments of the human person. So, it has something to do with the good uh, the GMRC, or the good moral and right conduct that we were taught, or that our teachers taught us when we were in elementary particularly. So why do you think it is important? First and foremost, ethics is considered as a requirement for human life. Imagine a human life or a human person without ethics is like a dead. Bakit? Kung ikaw ay isang tao na walang magandang pag-uugali, walang kagandahang asal na tinataglay sa iyong pagkatao, definitely you cannot gain friends. Definitely you cannot socialize, and you cannot be accepted by the world. Or the world itself cannot, let us say na, kung wala kang pag-uugali, even though the world itself cannot exist. Diba? Kasi nga, sabi natin, merong friendship, merong magandang relationship, pakikipag-ugnayan na nagaganap sa mundong ibabaw because of that right conduct we are portraying or possessing to one another. So it is our means of deciding a course of action. So you cannot detect anymore, or you cannot say na mali or tama ang ginagawa ng isang tao without ethics. And that is why ethics is very important, because that directs our actions, that define who we are. Our ethics define who we are as a human person, because what we value, what we appreciate, what we prioritize, that speaks or that speak who we are. And aside from that, there would be no way to work towards a goal, because there would be no way to pick between a limitless number of goals. So imagine kung ang mundo ay walang ethics, there would be chaos. Napakagulo. Sapakin mo man yung katabi mo, sipain mo man yung katabi mo, umattend ka man ng philosophy class or what, makapagtapos ka man or hindi, sampalin mo man yung kasama mo sa bahay, definitely okay lang kung walang ethics. Okay? Third, epistemology is the study of or method of acquiring knowledge. So it has something to do with how do we know things. It deals with nature, sources, limitations, validity of knowledge. And basically, it explains how we know what we claim to know, how we can find out what we wish to know, and how we can differentiate truth from falsehood. So, it's important because it explains how we think. So, in other words, sa pamamagitan ng epistemology, natutukoy, nakikilala, nakikita natin papaano nag-iisip ang isang tao. So you yourself, you may know how do you think, papaano tumatakbo ang pag-iisip mo through the aid of this epistemology. So it is required in order to be able to determine the true from false by determining a proper method of evaluation. And it is also needed in order to use and obtain knowledge of the world around us. So without epistemology, probably we could not think, we could not rationalize, we could not explain. In other words, we would have what we call brain dead at all. And definitely, we are becoming dead already because our minds are not functioning well. The last one is logic. It deals with reasoning, and it means a treatise on matters pertaining to the human thought, and its main concern is the truth or the validity of our arguments regarding such objects. So, logic is very important because through this logic, we could not immediately jump into conclusion, but rather, we are trying our best to think the best possible way to create or to conclude something in our life. Then, aesthetics. It has something to do with arts. It has something to do with how do we appreciate things in other perspective. How do we look at the things positively? So, in other words, it includes the sublime, comic, tragic, pathetic, and ugly experiences that we may encounter in our lives. So, it is important simply because it vitalizes our knowledge. It helps us to live more deeply and richly. Bakit? The more you give meaning to your life, the more your life is becoming wonderful and meaningful at all. The more we think that we look the things positively, definitely we live our life to the fullest. And third, it brings us in touch with our culture. So whenever we will be talking about aesthetics, hindi lang ito yung sa larangan ng pagguhit or sining ng pagguhit, but rather it includes the different cultures, customs, and traditions that made our identity as a human person. So again, the branches of philosophy consist of metaphysics, literally after or beyond the physical, the study of ultimate reality or how things really are. Epistemology, the study of knowledge or how to tell when we really know something. Ethics, the study of moral problems, right and wrong, and practical reasoning. Logic, the study of the rules of correct reasoning. And aesthetics, the study of feelings and judgments that are related to beauty and art. So these are the branches of philosophy. Let us now proceed to what we call a philosophic question. So according to Isaiah Berlin, in order for a question to be considered as a philosophic question, it should possess three characteristics. And first, it is often very broad or general. So if you still remember the question of Thales, it could be considered as a philosophic question. Why? Because it is very general. So ano ba yung tanong ni Thales? What is the primal substance that constitutes reality? Or what is the ultimate substance or principles that explain reality? From that characteristic arrive the second characteristic, which is there is no single methodology for answering this question. So going back to the question of Thales, kung ano ba talaga ang pinagmulan ng realidad or ano ba talaga ang bumubuo sa pag-iral ng daigdig or lahat ng umiiral sa mundo, from that question, we may notice that there is no single method. Hindi mo siya pwedeng sagutin sa iisang pamamaraan lang. There should be always multiple methodology of or for answering the question. And third, it seems to have no practical utility. So, ibig sabihin, masagot mo man yung tanong or hindi, it doesn't matter. Okay? So, walang paroroonan kung masagot mo man siya or hindi. So, these are the characteristics of a philosophic question according to Berlin. Now, in different texts, philosophy is considered as a second-order inquiry. So what does it mean? At this point of time, we will try to differentiate science from philosophy. So here are the differences between science and philosophy. Science follow the method of his science strictly while doing his experiment in his laboratory. So in other words, sa science daw, ang scientist ay masusing sinusundan kung ano ang method na kinakailangan para sa kanyang eksperimento sa laboratory. So for example, gagawa kayo ng isang chemical, kung ano yung nakasaad na step by steps, a scientist always follow that strictly. But on the other hand, in philosophy, philosophers would always ask general questions regarding the underlying assumptions of the scientist in doing his science and experiments. So, hindi lang mahalaga sa mga philosophers na matapos mo yung experiment mo sa laboratory, but rather they are always trying to ask the question, why are you doing that kind of experiment? So, doon natin makikita yung pagkakaiba ng science at ng philosophy. Because sa science, after having your conclusion or stating your conclusion, that the experiment itself is almost done or already done. But in philosophy, though you have that kind of conclusion, there is always a follow-up questions regarding your purpose, your intentions for giving that answer or for performing that kind of experiment. Then, scientists in science will not dare to question his scientific method or the practice and protocol of his discipline. So in other words, dahil ito na yung kinagisnan ko, ito naman talaga yung scientific method from the very beginning, then I, as a scientist, I have no right to dare to question or not, to question that scientific method. Bakit? Kasi ang tagal na niya nag-exist. And definitely, I will be using this all throughout. Then, in philosophy, philosophers are trying to criticize and scrutinize the methods of the sciences and to question their assumptions. So, dito makikita natin yung pagkakaiba. Sa science, ito yung binigay, ito yung method, ito yung gagawin ko. Pero sa philosophy, ang ginagawa ng mga philosophers, they tried to criticize. Bakit yung method na yan ang susundin natin? They tried to scrutinize. Obserbahan natin kung talagang magiging epektibo ang bagay na yan. Third, in science, the scientist will tell what he will do is to come up with legitimately descriptive and explanatory questions and answering them as precisely and as exactly as he can, doing his science as a first-order inquiry. But in philosophy, philosophers is doing or considered as a second-order inquiry. In other words, science is considered as queen of sciences and philosophy is considered science of sciences. So both science and philosophy's views contain a certain measure of truth. So yung pananaw or yung pagpapaliwanag, perspective ni science at saka ng philosophy, it both contain a certain measure of truth. Pareho silang may sukatan. Ano ang totoo? Okay? So, science with its tradition, specific objects of study and vast range of exact methods of observation and experiment exerts influence on many spheres. While in philosophy, is the self-awareness of the sciences and the sources from which all the sciences draw their worldview and methodological principles. Okay? And according to Frederick Wiseman, anong sinabi niya? Philosophy is vision. Why? Because it is a new way of looking at things, and it will give us always a different and a broader perspective in understanding others. So in other words, in philosophy, you have to always look not only at a particular part of the topic or the thing or the object itself, but rather in a broader perspective so that you may be able to understand the underlying principle of reality and existence in the world. And for that, it is the end of the lesson 1. Thank you very much, and I hope you learned something in our today's discussion. God bless you all.